Who is the person you can speak with, knowing they will sit with you and actually listen without interrupting? Why do we struggle with listening? And what is it anyway? I'm Karen.
And I'm Nuala. And we are the Safety Collaborators.
And our mission is to help people have better conversations and change the way they think about safety.
Whilst reading a novel recently, I was inspired by this paragraph. However sad and pathetic it is at the age of 13 to still be sharing one's bed with an ancient toy bunny rabbit, I do not care. He, the bee, is my talisman, my safety net, and my friend. I tell him everything. I've often thought that if someone could gather all the gazillions of cuddly child comforters together and interrogate them, they would know far more about the child they sleep with than any of the kids' parents, simply because they actually listen without interrupting. From The Olive Tree by Lucinda Riley.
What a lovely story to enter into today's podcast. So let's talk about listening. Listening is a critical component of the speaking and language. We speak to be listened to, yet that does not guarantee we are being heard or understood.
No, it is not. And we often talk about listening, active listening, being mindful, being in the moment, being engaged. And yet, so often when someone is speaking, they just feel cut off or disengaged, pouring their hearts out and going, I can hear, even though this is a telephone call, that this person is not listening to a word I'm saying. I'm just on the other end of the line. And actually having a deep, meaningful moment or sharing an inspirational idea, and they're probably looking at Facebook. So why do we find it so hard to stop and give somebody the gift of being heard? And I think we've all had those experiences, whether it's a serious moment or a not so serious moment. And Karen, when you think about that question, why do we find it so hard to just listen? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
I don't think we really know what it means. What I mean by that is I think most people think that listening is just hearing the noise around them and waiting for a gap and then interrupt that space, if you like, with whatever's coming into their mind, whatever they can hear in their head. But really listening is about hearing and interpretation. So if we think about what is listening, it's more than just hearing, because we hear noise, we intake sound, vibration. I'm not going to get into the technical aspects of how we hear, because that's a whole nother story I know nothing about, biology. But, when we're hearing, it isn't just what we hear. And I think this also leads into when we talk about levels of listening. So level 1 is when we just hear noise, we hear stuff, we're not really paying attention, we are just literally waiting for our turn to speak or to interrupt whatever it is that's making a noise in front of us.
I'm focused on my big idea. Could you hurry up and shut up?
Exactly. But listening is actually about hearing, and I'll probably say this a few times, it's about hearing plus how we interpret what we're hearing. And that's how we make sense of the world.
And the interpretation is so critical because it's not just going, oh, that's interesting, but considering where does that interpretation come from? The interpretation comes from our experiences. It comes from our upbringing, from our cultures, our learning, our way of working. And there are so many things. And I just think of how many times something has been miscommunicated, especially in cross-cultural or cross-language environments, because my interpretation of what you are saying is not matching the picture in your head. But I've got a very clear picture in my head and I'm running with it. Honey, I've got this. Don't you worry. And I'm off on a tangent and it's like, what on earth is she doing? That wasn't what I meant at all.
At all. And how many times we find ourselves in that situation, where we haven't fully listened to the whole instruction. So coming back to the work thing, somebody says the first 3 words, which we're very familiar with, and then we go, all right, I know what they mean, and off we go.
I've got this.
I'm often saying to people, is wait till the end of the conversation. And this is not my greatest strength, by the way, is waiting till the end of somebody else speaking. So I understand that this takes work for anyone, for you who's listening to us. We know it takes work. All right, this is not an easy thing to do. But interestingly, our listening is automatic. It is always on. It doesn't really turn off.
Good point.
Right?
Not something I even thought about.
Always on and ready. So the critical thing is, well, what is it that we're hearing?
And what is it we're not hearing?
What are we not hearing? And then what is the interpretation that we make of all of that? I'm going to run through a little list here of statements, if you like, that might help you to get a slightly different sense of what listening might be. So this comes from the body of work of what we call ontological coaching. Don't worry about too much what that means, but it essentially means that we coach to the human soul. So we talk about how we interpret language, how we hear, how our emotions play into that, because our emotions make a big difference into how we hear and interpret, and then how do we physically react. So when we talk about ontological coaching, we're talking about all of these elements. But listening is a very critical piece to the language part, to the languaging part of being human. So we speak to be listened to, but it doesn't ensure that being listened to is being understood. Listening is what we call a linguistic act. So it's part of the languaging that we are involved with. And it's never passive, always there. So it's a very active process and part of that languaging that we do. It consists of silent and often invisible internal conversations.
And don't those noises get in the way sometimes?
They can be incredibly loud. You'll hear us say a few times today, listening to our listening can be an interruption. It can be an enemy of learning. It can be a range of interruptions, if you like. So therefore we say listening, as I said, is equals hearing and interpretation. We as humans are walking sets of interpretations. You think of our biases, our stereotyping, all of this. This is all part of that interpreting that we do as we move around. And our interpretations, as you said a little bit earlier, is triggered by our events and circumstances that we've experienced throughout our lives. Not just what's in front of us right now, but often what's come from our past gets dredged up really quick. We do have elephant memories. It's amazing what we remember. Listening is about meaning. It is a meaning-making activity, and we impose our meaning onto the world. So how we hear things and interpret is how we view the world. So you start to get a sense now that listening is an awful lot more than just what we hear.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very physical, turned-on function of being a human being.
It's also giving a sense of just why it can be so easily, misunderstood, or how things can go misinterpreted, how things can go wrong. Yep. It's just so easily when you think.
Exactly.
A bit like breathing, sometimes we just go onto the surface. We don't actually go deeper than that.
No, exactly right. Let's talk a little bit about that listening to your listening. So one of the things that we like to often say to people is pay attention, and this takes practice, where you actually try to turn off your brain, which is impossible. It is impossible to do that, right? So it does take practice where you get your own thoughts. They will come flying through while you're listening to other people. But you just sort of say, thanks very much, metaphorically speaking, and let me focus on who's in front of me. And you'll get a better chance of getting the right interpretation.
And that is something that was one of the key fundamentals that I learned when I was studying coaching many years ago. And it was a total light bulb moment for me. You mean I can actually just acknowledge my thoughts and then let them go? Mm-hmm. And after a while of practicing, I was amazed at just how well that works, because I will literally say to myself in my head, you're interesting, come back later. And then go back to the conversation that's at hand. And it leads so much into the embrace the silence, because our brains need time to process. They need time to just kind of go, where am I now? What's happening? Oh, you just asked a great question. And I think we often mention that when you've asked a good question and there isn't an immediate response, pat yourself on the back, because it means you've got the person you're sitting with really thinking. Then give them that space of silence to process, and you will be amazed. What feels like 5 minutes is probably 10 or 20 seconds, to be honest.
Absolutely.
It just feels like, oh my gosh, is this person ever going to speak?
Yeah.
But they are so busy in their head formulating what they're wanting to say that that few seconds flies by for them. So sit back and appreciate the moment. Just go, awesome. I will hold the space for you. I will just sit with you and hold the space.
And this applies to friends in need, getting the job done, decision making, learning. It applies to every area of our lives. And it really is one of the greatest gifts, which you often say. It's one of the greatest gifts we can give people, is to truly sit and listen. I think a couple of podcasts ago we actually mentioned, was it Pooh Bear and Piglet?
That was just coming to mind for me as well.
Yeah, they're sitting there on that lovely piece of log in the forest, and you just see them from behind. And Pooh Bear's not having a very good day. He's feeling sad and melancholy. And Piglet sits down beside him. And Pooh looks at him and goes, "What are you doing?" He said, "Nothing." "But what do you mean, nothing?"
Yep.
"Well, I'm just here for you. I'm just going to give you that space. If you need me, I'm here. But I'm not going to say anything." So I think in this case, Piglet is actually listening to the feelings that he could see. Listening isn't just about noise. It's about observation.
And there's a couple of things that's triggered for me, but the first one I'm going to is the work by Nancy Klein on time to think. And when I first learned about the time to think style of coaching and silent coaching, I was like, what?
Yes.
Someone's going to want me to sit there for half an hour and just go, "So what would you like to talk about?" and then be quiet. You have got to be joking.
Yeah.
I mean, like, really, talk about a ripoff.
It's awkward as well. Like, it feels really intense.
It does. However, for the right person, the value of just being heard and knowing someone else is in the room but is not going to comment. They're just going to give you the energy to process what you need to say. And we do that sometimes ourselves. We've kind of embraced that. We don't really have anything to talk about, but let's log into Zoom and we'll just carry on working on our own, but we're around. And one of us might end up just literally expressing the thoughts that are running through our head without needing comment or feedback. But it's creating that space. And the more I read up and actually offered that to a few clients, it was amazing, the responses of, "I'm here to hold the space for you to just talk through your ideas. What would you like to talk to today?" And then just let them go and be present. Doesn't mean that I'm running off in my head listening to a million other things. Being present, it's maintaining eye contact. It's maintaining the energy in that space. It's just holding whatever that period of time is. And maybe it's 5 minutes, maybe it's half an hour. But that person knowing that they are being 100% heard without expectation of response is amazing.
Absolutely. I think that without expectation for response is the part that makes everybody feel quite uncomfortable. We're living in such a busy world where everything is distracted by the next thing, whether it's visually, audibly, in so many different ways. So talking or asking a question and then being quiet.
Conversations that matter are where we're at. So let us know what you want to chat about. Mail us at hello@safetycollaborations.com and we'll get back to you. Okay, now on with the show. One of the things we chat about quite often is setting expectations. This was the other thing that triggered for me earlier, before you even start the conversation.
Good point.
So whether it is a coaching session,
Yes,
a work conversation, a friend conversation, and going, what is your expectation today? Do you want to fix something, and do you want me to help you fix it? Do you want advice? Do you want me to give you my thoughts and opinions? Or do you want me to just listen to you and hold my thoughts and my advice to myself and just reframe what you're saying, or, turn it back to you just to make sure I'm understanding it?
Or not.
Exactly. Because when someone just wants to be heard and you're going in and you're trying to fix, it's so frustrating. It's like, I don't want you to fix it. I just want to be able to get out of my head what's floating in my head. So just listen and just hear me out for a moment. And then I'll decide what I want.
When we come across people who are what we deem to be in pain, whether they're sad about something or there's this general human desire, I think, for most people to go, let me help you. Go and dive in with the hug, or go and put your arms around them and say, it's okay, or pat them on the back or whatever. And when in fact, that's the last thing on earth that they want. They just need the silence or to be listened to and nothing else. And as you just rightly said, then you give the power to that person. The power lies with them.
Yep.
You haven't taken it away from them. And that's, when we go in to try and fix things, we can often be quite depowering when we do that, even though that's not the intention.
And then we forget that now we suddenly own it.
Exactly. Then you think, I didn't mean for me to have to fix. Yeah, anyway, yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There was a post I was reading, I think it was either LinkedIn or Instagram, I can't remember.
Yeah.
But it was a couple who were starting to get into quite head-butting sessions around not being heard. And they actually came up with acronyms. So I think it was TIFY, this is for you, TIFM, this is for me, and TIF, the letter U, this is for us. TIFM, this is for me. I'm just venting. I just want to let go. I don't need you to do anything. For you is like, and I think it was mostly around their children, actually. Right. It was like, okay, this is a dad thing. You deal with it. This is for you. And us thing was like, okay, this is something that we need to make a mutual decision and choose a path on. But I thought that was quite lovely.
I love that. I've written it down.
What are your codes, or what are your ways of telling your colleagues, your friends, your spouses, this is what I need from you right now? And there's no offense taken.
No, that's conversational rituals again. How do we expand that? And we get embarrassed, I think. For some reason, we feel a bit of guilt or shame or embarrassment when we want to say things like that, but we don't, which brings in that whole, what mood are we in? What emotional state are we in? This influences all of that, those moments. So TIFY, this is for you. TIFM, this is for me. And TIU, this is for us.
This is for us. It's so simple, but
brilliant.
It's like...
Is it TIFU?
Yeah.
Yeah. This
TIFU.
is FU.
This is for us. Yeah.
Yes.
Preferably not to FU.
No,
but just...
exactly. Well, that could happen.
Well, it happens so often when we don't have these conversational rituals in place. Yeah. It just takes away the potential for misunderstanding or conflict, because it's usually you get so frustrated when someone is trying to help you, and it's often a loved one or somebody who's close to you. So how do you say not now? I don't need this now. Now I just need to be heard.
I think when we take it back into the workplace, this is absolutely leads into this whole piece around conversational waste. When we don't have these conversational rituals, when we don't sit and listen through the instructions clearly, because that's as much my responsibility as it is the person's giving me the instructions responsibility.
I need to make sure that I'm understanding, but if I'm not understanding and you see I am not understanding, you need to find a different way to tell me.
Exactly. That also leads into, of course, is this a psychologically safe space to be able to do that? So are we able to, do I feel safe enough to say, I'm sorry, Mr. Boss, I'm not quite understanding, putting up my hand.
Yeah.
I know you can't see that, but we can. And therefore, reducing that conversational waste. If we can create these safer spaces, we have a better understanding of what is listening, that we can appreciate that it's not just what I hear, but also how I interpret, then they may go a long way towards reducing that conversational waste. That happens across the board in homes, but in organisations, it's one of the greatest hidden costs. How many times do we have to repeat ourselves? And why is that?
It really is.
Because we weren't listening properly in the first place.
And also being able to say, depending on the conversation, now is not a good time.
Yeah.
And if it's not a safety critical, operational critical kind of moment, we have to make a decision or I have to be heard right now. But being able to say, I'm not going to be able to give you the focus you need because I'm trying to finish this email or I'm trying to finish this proposal. But if you give me an hour, we can meet, or we can meet over lunch, or we can meet in the coffee break, and I can give you my undivided attention. Because then you don't feel like you're trying to multitask and let the person down who wants to be heard, and let yourself down because you're not going to be able to do the job you need to do effectively. But also, the person doesn't have to feel disappointed, like, oh, you know, I went to Karen in a moment of need and she just freaking carried on typing there. I mean, she's just so rude. No, actually, I just really need to get this done.
Exactly.
So again, to create the safe space, sometimes we have to say, I can't give it to you now, but let's set a time when I can give it to you.
Yeah.
Because there is nothing worse than not being heard. And I mean, this wasn't a kind of like operational safety critical moment, but many years ago, when I was once upon a time still married, I was doing some work at a refinery. And because of traffic and what have you, my ex-husband had dropped me off and he came to fetch me that afternoon, and it was the first day of the program we were running, and I was so excited. And we're driving home and I'm telling him all about this amazing day that I've had and the responses in the group and what have you. And then I looked at him and I said, could you close your window? Because it was getting a little bit nippy. And then I carry on talking and blah, blah. And then I go, could you close the window? And I carry on. And then I go, have you heard a word I've said? Of course I have. Well, then why is the window still open? Thankfully, I'm a big enough person that it did become like one of those jokes that lasted for the rest of our marriage.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But it was like, so why is the window open whenever I felt I wasn't being listened to?
See, then you have something, there's a conversation turned into a ritual. Yeah.
Exactly. You know, and sometimes those conversational rituals come out of awkward moments.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Years ago when we were running workshops, we used to use there was a plane in a hangar. Let's call it Bob and Alan. I can't honestly remember who the names were. It doesn't really matter. So it's coming towards the end of the day and they were cleaning something, cleaning the plane. I think it was a small plane. And essentially the person that was cleaning the plane was saying, okay, I'm just going to finish this up here. Can you turn the hose off or something like that as we leave the hangar? He put some soap in the water, something along those. I'm going to have to dig this video up and I'll put it into the show notes because it's quite a funny one and it's how we just misinterpret things. The end result being, of course, when they went back the next day, the entire hangar is full of soap, bubbles and whatever.
Bubbles.
And I thought I heard you say X, and he said, well, this is what I heard, and that was the end result. I will dig it up. It's brilliant.
Oh, my God, foam party.
I just can't remember the exact thing what happened, but I still have this vision in my head of this entire plane hangar full of soap bubbles.
Oh, my word, that is hysterical. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't at the time.
I'm sure it wasn't for them, no. Somebody had to clean it up afterwards.
Let's reiterate those points that you mentioned earlier again, because I think those are so critical.
Yeah. So I think, one, we speak to be listened to. Speaking does not ensure that you are being heard or, more importantly, understood. Listening is a linguistic phenomenon, as we call it. So it's part of languaging. It's part of how we use language to interpret our world. Listening is not passive. It's a very active process, which is part of our languaging. It consists of the silent and often invisible internal conversations that we constantly having with ourselves. So how do we slow down the listening to our listening? It is not just an auditory state, it's also about listening to the generic terms and thoughts and images that we have within us. So listening is also the imagery. If you think about, we sometimes talk about playing the movies in our head or the stories we're telling ourselves. That's actually listening. We're listening to our own internal stories and movies. At the heart of it all, listening is the two elements of hearing and interpreting. So henceforth, it's such an active process. Humans are walking sets of interpretations. So whether it's our internal interpretation, external, doesn't matter. That's how we see the world. And it's triggered by events and circumstances. So our past history, current histories, these all impact how we hear and listen. So listening is about meaning, and it's about meaning making. And we impose our meaning onto the world that we live in. So bearing in mind that we we do interpret the world from our own lens, which is also very heavily influenced by how we hear, both internal and external phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, listening is a crucial factor in communication. Without it, you're not really communicating. I think that's probably the most important piece of all of this. It's a critical part of how we make sense of the world and how we communicate.
Especially for those of us who have the gift of being able to hear.
Indeed.
Although you can listen in many ways.
That's such a good point. Whether it's sign language, whether it's different languages, you can still interpret meaning. And we do it all the time. We're working with different people from different cultures and different languages all the time, and sometimes two completely different languages. And yet, if you take the time to listen through your eyes and your ears, you can interpret the meaning of that conversation. I don't know if I've shared this story before, but I was in China and I was traveling on a bus with a friend of mine who was living in China, both Australian, but he'd already been there for about 6 months. And he was there teaching English as a second language. And of course, he was learning Mandarin himself. So here we are on a rickshaw. So here my friend Greg is very busy trying to communicate with the rickshaw driver, who was trying to communicate with Greg. And of course, Greg is so intent on trying to get the language right that he missed it completely, right?
Oh, shame.
So they're both having this completely disjointed conversation. Him in his broken Mandarin, the other in his version. They weren't understanding. And of course, I'm just observing. I am just sitting there watching. And after a little while, I thought, Greg, I think all he wants us to do is to hop out of the rickshaw, wait on the side here while he goes and gets his cousin to then take us to make sure that the restaurant's open for us for dinner. And the Chinese man was nodding his head in agreement because he couldn't speak, but he could understand sort of what I was saying. And Greg goes, how the hell do you do that?
How did you get that? The whole picture. Just step
watching
back.
And listening and interpreting. You're going to get it right every time? Not necessarily, but, you got to keep trying.
We have the most wonderful opportunity to celebrate the gift that we get to give of listening.
Yeah.
Because being heard is a very, very powerful and empowering present.
Indeed. And on that note,
thank you for joining us today. It is always lovely to have conversations that matter. Connect with us on our website, safetycollaborations.com, where you will find the show notes for this episode, and Karen will dig out the link to a video so we can see a foam party in an airline hangar.
Oh, I'll put a couple.
Leave us a message on the live chat. Follow us on LinkedIn, Karen Avari and Nuala Gage. And it would be wonderful if you enjoyed this and found it valuable and that you've learned something. Spread the word. Follow us on your favorite podcast platform and share it with others.
Before we go, we really want to thank everybody who's listening. Our little podcast is growing, and that's because of you. So we thank you. We're already up to 750 downloads or something or other, and it's become fun. And it's fun because you're there with us. So thank you for that.
And you're right. Your notes and the comments that you share once you've heard our podcast go so far. I mean, I just think of, the comments that Ross put up and Alessandro and Kenan on some of our latest podcasts. We read every one of them and we respond. So your feedback is so valued, and we are grateful that we get a chance to listen to you as well.
So please reach out to us. Till next week, stay safe, stay well.